Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me? You can't hear me. So I'll have to speak louder then. My name is John Micgiel. I am the president of the Kościuszko Foundation, and I welcome you to the Kościuszko House. This, as some of you may know, is one in a long series of meetings that have been held occasionally in this building since 1945. So we're not reinventing the wheel. We're following a long tradition of academic lectures, of other kinds of activities that are encouraged here by the Kościuszko Foundation, and I'm very happy to see that there are many friendly faces in the audience. I'm very happy to see you. There are members of our board of trustees from the Kościuszko Foundation, which is always nice to see. And of course, there are many friends from other organizations and also individuals who are my friends. And I'm very happy that you came for an evening discussion of the Ukrainian crisis and Poland. To be honest, 30 years ago, had you asked somebody who was Polish or in Poland about Ukraine, you probably would not have gotten any response. And that would have been mostly because of the way the Soviet Union organized life after the Second World War in that part of the world. So there was very little contact between peoples, and even the elites had a tough time communicating, and usually had to do so via Moscow. If you had asked 20 years ago Poles about what they thought about Ukraine, and Ukrainians what they thought about Poles, you would have heard a cacophony of accusations about who started the massacres, where the massacres were, how many people were killed here and how many people were killed there. Not really a great way to effect change in a place that really, really desperately needed it. 10 years ago, things were already different in Poland because, I think, of the economic changes that had taken place. What does that mean? It means that once people started to see beyond the old models and saw a future for themselves and their children, they began slowly to go away from the old stereotypes and the old myths. In the middle of all that, academia in Poland and in Ukraine and in the United States played a role. The role was basically to discuss things in a civilized fashion, and those discussions, particularly among historians who talked about Polish-Ukrainian relations over the years, really didn't lead to any kind of major changes. It wasn't until the Orange Revolution and the participation of lots of Poles in what was going on in Kiev that made a difference. Today, when you ask a Pole about what's going on in Ukraine, there's a great deal of trepidation. People are nervous, and rightly so. They're as nervous in Poland today as Germans were in 1989 about what was happening in Poland. It's not unreasonable to expect people to want their neighbor to be a stable political partner and to have at least some kind of prosperity. So things have changed over the last 30 years. They're changing now, even as we speak. The U.S. newspapers don't really carry a great deal about the details of what goes on in Ukraine. Hardly surprising. It's hardly surprising because they don't carry a good deal of detail about what happens anyplace else in that part of the world. But we're very lucky because if I have to know something about what gives in Ukraine, I go to my old pal, Adrian Karatnycky, who's going to be speaking in just a little while. And I thought I'd briefly tell you a little bit about Adrian, who is the go-to person for things Ukrainian. So if you are at Harvard University and you're waiting for somebody to tell you what gives in Kiev, Adrian is the man that they will go to. He's connected with a large number of organizations both here in New York City and in Washington. He's just come back from Ukraine. Adrian spent, 12 years maybe, something like that, as the president of Freedom House here in New York City and in Washington, D.C., where he began a series of publications that ranked countries in the world according to different classification systems and produced a number of annual reports like, for example, Nations in Transit, which is a very thick volume that comes out once a year and tells people how countries are doing in different areas. These days, Adrian spends a lot of time with the Atlantic Council, a very esteemed organization in Washington, D.C. And as I said, since he's just come back from Ukraine, he's going to tell us a little bit about what's been going on in that country, basically from November of last year when demonstrations and protests started on Independence Square, the Maidan in Kiev, until today. And even from my own reading of the different newspapers, the amount of fighting and the number of people who are still being killed in Ukraine is staggering. So the number of people who have disappeared, the so-called Heavenly 100, which some of you may have heard about, people who basically just disappeared off the face of the earth beginning in November of last year, all give us pause for, well, for a good reason. Nobody wants to see that kind of tragedy happening across the border. You may remember during the Second World War that Franklin Delano Roosevelt had that famous speech in which he said, when referring to Lend-Lease, that if I see my neighbor's barn burning, I give him my hose and help him to put out the fire. What I will be talking about is Poland's role and its reaction to things that are happening in Ukraine. So rather than give Adrian's speech for him, I think I'm going to discreetly sit down and let him say what he wants to say.
Thank you, John. Thank you, dear friends. A sort of a preamble to my presentation. I visited Poland after the emergence of the Solidarność movement in March of 1981. It was the first of several trips I took before martial law. And I remember walking past Warsaw University after having had one or two meetings. It was a brisk, cold day, and it was dark. But I saw some ads and placards posted on a screen, on a vitrine leading into the university, announcing a talk by Jacek Kuroń at the Auditorium Maximum of Warsaw University, the title of which was, "Without an Independent Ukraine, there cannot be an independent Poland." And having spent many years connected to and concerned with and reading and trying to understand Ukraine and its neighborhood, I was well aware of the very important role that Kultura played. And Jerzy Giedroyc, I had the privilege of visiting him a couple times in Maison Lafitte, having interesting conversations at a lot of tea, and knowing that group of people, Juliusz Mieroszewski, a number of writers who also advanced those ideas that then very, I would say, quixotic ideas that Kuroń was embodying. But here it was something serious. Here was a movement of 10 million people. Here was one of the main political leaders of that movement, and he was articulating a geopolitical vision and a geopolitical understanding. And what I want to say is that the Polish government, the Polish people, have for the last, through thick or thin, for the last 23 years been watching the roller coaster of Ukraine's evolution, and have patiently tried to offer it solidarity, support, and assistance, and in the most important way, by creating an effective model of a reasonably prosperous democratic state. And I think that, in a sense, is the greatest gift that the Polish nation has bequeathed upon Ukrainians, and certainly upon Central and Western Ukrainians who have seen, some of whom work in, some of whom travel, and see how Poland has transformed while their country has remained stagnant, which is a preamble to what I want to talk about. On November 21st, so it's just a little over a half a year ago, after a reversal of the policy that the government of President Viktor Yanukovych had pursued over a 2-year period of alleged integration and nearing to a signing of a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement and an association agreement with the European Union, Mr. Yanukovych had reversed course. A few journalists, a few activists sent out some notes on Twitter and on Facebook calling for people to gather in the central square to express their opposition to this political course. That was the seed of what became the Maidan. That was the seed of this massive, long protest that lasted month after month, where it swelled, where crowds swelled on weekends to as many as 500,000 people. Protests emerged in other parts of the country, and unfortunately there began to be this cascading of death and violence, which resulted in the death of over 100 protesters, many of them just picked off by snipers 3 months later in February. We all know what happened, the collapse of the Yanukovych government, and then I'll talk a little bit later about what occurred after the collapse and the sort of Russian annexation, the war by proxy that Mr. Putin is waging against Ukraine, and the like. But first, let me sort of start with the reasons why dictatorship and why a corrupt regime fell in Ukraine. There are many theories and many explanations of why a relatively powerful regime, which had just signed a new agreement with Russia and seemed to have the support of President Putin, deep financial support, lower gas prices, lines of credit, turning its back on the West, being supported by someone who is known to be able to build up your capacity to repress and oppress. Mr. Putin, I think, has none of the sort of moral qualms that some other leaders might have about the use of force to suppress opposition. And yet it was possible through civic action to bring down that regime. Why was it possible? And I would argue that it is because Mr. Yanukovych made two fundamental mistakes. Number one, he changed the two main tenets of how Ukraine had been governed over the last 23 years. First, he changed what was called the two-vector foreign policy, a foreign policy of not making a choice between East and West. And first he pushed it officially towards the West, and then he reversed ground and immediately pushed it towards the East. This created a lot of turmoil and a lot of enemies among constituencies that he had helped create. First, he had created rising expectations about European integration. Then he dashed those, creating a set of enemies in society and business and in civic life and even in portions of the Ukrainian political establishment. Secondly, he had violated a cardinal rule of past presidents of Ukraine, that they were seen to be arbiters between very powerful oligarchic groups. The Ukrainian market economy evolved in a way very different from Poland, and Poland has a lot of very rich people. It has its own sort of Forbes list of billionaires and so on. But their relative control and influence over the economy is much more modest than, there is no one in Poland who controls 7% of GDP as Mr. Renat Akhmetov, the richest man in Ukraine, does. And the top 20 people in Ukraine probably control about 35 to 40% of economic life. Nothing like that. I mean, there are a lot of rich people, but I doubt if the 20 richest people in Poland would control more than 10, at most 12% of economic activity. So this group of very powerful, influential figures who had their own media resources, they had their own what we would call soft power, which is to say they owned sports clubs, they had charitable activities and the like. They had to be dealt with, and Yanukovych was the first guy who broke the rule of Ukrainian that had been the practice in Ukraine and took those interests on, not for the sake of reform, but for the sake of accumulating incredible wealth. He made a determination that in 4 years, he and his family were going to become the richest economic player in the country. And he did it by pillaging the economy, by attacking all of these oligarchic interests. So I think if anyone wanted to do a formula for a revolution, alienate the society, give them the wrong directions, raise expectations, change directions, change the way things had been done for 20 years, and do the same thing in the economy. Yanukovych was that man. At the same time, he also laid the groundwork for some of the troubles we're seeing in Ukraine today, because he had, frankly, he also had some American political consultants who believed in wedge politics and who believed in advising him to use cultural politics in a country where there wasn't a lot of growth, there wasn't a lot to give to the people, partly because he was stealing from the people. He used wedge issues, and he tried to polarize the society along a pro-Russian, anti-Russian narrative, meaning in one direction was the narrative of anti-communism, the victory of the people against the old Soviet system, and the other was the glorification of the victory in the Second World War, common holidays with Russia, common cooperation with the Russian Orthodox Church, the Moscow Patriarchate of the Russian Orthodox Church, endless visits of the Patriarch and political lobbyist Kirill, the Patriarch of the Russian Church, to Ukraine, and wedging the Ukrainian language versus the Russian language as an issue, as a conflictual issue. So all these things, I think, came to a head on November 21st. If you were to have gone out onto that square on November 21st, you wouldn't have been very impressed with what you saw. You probably saw a few hundred students standing there, not doing very much. A few hundred journalists standing with flags of the European Union and so on. And you would have thought, okay, this is going to blow over. It's a pretty pathetic event. But what happened in the following days was that the government felt threatened even by these small numbers, because they would not move. They came day after day. And so they decided in the dead of night, first to make an assault at the end of November, November 30th, against these protesters, beat them mercilessly, cracked heads, concussed, and all of this was being broadcast. Why was it on television? Why was it being broadcast if Yanukovych was an authoritarian? Well, because he had alienated, as I had indicated, these oligarchs, these businessmen. And they were fighting a rearguard action to put him back in his place, to push back against him. And so the media of these oligarchs was not working at the beck and call of Mr. Yanukovych. It actually was publicizing the violence, documenting it, and raising the ire and anger of the citizens of Kyiv, who were concerned about the change of policy, but now this attack on their young, this attack on innocent students created such an outrage that the weekend after the beatings, 500,000 people turned up into the streets of Kyiv, and then we had the cascading events that eventually led to Mr. Yanukovych leaving. There, as I say, was a rearguard action by much of the political establishment to try to put Yanukovych under control. In fact, the fact that there was strong support for European integration among the oligarchs of Ukraine was in part driven by their desire to put parameters and to create legal structures and responsibilities before some form of adult supervision to keep this rather megalomaniacal man from accumulating incredible wealth. In the old days, the way the families of Ukrainian presidents made money was in a sort of a gradual, incremental way. They got favors in terms of government tenders, they got lines of credit issued through banks that they may have owned from the central bank. Everything was done gradually. It simulated the gradual growth of business. But with Yanukovych, it was different. It was basically every oligarch, 50% of what you made, cash transactions, just shifted in huge amounts to the family. As much as $4 to $5 billion a year for Yanukovych and his personal family alone. And then there was a whole greedy entourage of hangers-on, ministers, and so on, who extracted another billion or two for their own reasons. For an economy that was only $180 to $200 billion economy, 6 or 7 billion, that's 3% of GDP. That has real impact. And suddenly, more and more money was moving into this cash economy, more and more pressure against these oligarchs. And so it was understandable that a portion of that establishment would not come to back him. He, of course, threatened them, cajoled them, and some of them fell back into line. But the fact that they opened up their media, the fact that they pushed back against him, and the fact that Ukraine still had elements of a semi-pluralistic parliamentary system with a fairly strong opposition, and a completely uncontrolled internet meant that there was a very strong capacity to self-organization, to the communication of information, and to the erosion of support for him. And so we come to February, the protests continue. Yanukovych fears the escalation of these protests, and he finally, under pressure, signs an agreement which is brokered by Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski and Alain Juppé, the French Foreign Minister, and Mr. Steinmeier, the German Foreign Minister, but really led by Radosław Sikorski. And it becomes sort of a formula, because within a day of that agreement, the crowds on the Maidan do not accept the fact that it is an agreement that will require Mr. Yanukovych to only leave in the autumn. They are not willing to tolerate, after so many people have been killed on the streets of Kiev, and they move. But I think something else happens. I think what happens is that Mr. Putin no longer has a confidence in the behavior and in the capacity of Mr. Yanukovych, and I think that he sends him a signal that he will not be backed. And so the day after the agreement, not only do police forces and militias retreat from the front lines around the Maidan, where there had been this carnage the day before, they disappear entirely. They stop protecting the president's home. They stop protecting the presidential offices, the presidential administration. There is no one from the militia to be seen within kilometers of the parliament or of the houses of government. And Yanukovych disappears. It's clear that some sort of signal was given to the power structures that Putin was withdrawing support. And I think Putin was withdrawing support precisely because he had a plan to counterattack in the resulting and unfolding chaos. So we know that Mr. Yanukovych flees. We know that he flees with huge amounts of wealth. In the days that follow, there is a sort of a euphoria as people discover the incredible wealth that he accumulated and the vulgar accumulation of objects and both very good art and vanity art that was created to honor him, hundreds of paintings embodying him as a Roman emperor, as this, as that, just incredible vulgar displays of crass commercialism. $600 million spent on building his own mansion just outside of Kiev. $600 million for a country of this size and of this level of development and poverty. So as this process unfolds, there is pushback in the East. Some of Mr. Yanukovych's allies initially back removing him. They're afraid of the takeover, but in a while they kind of begin to pull back, get a little bit of a measure of themselves, and they start bargaining in behalf of the East. And at the same time, Mr. Putin moves quickly to seize and to annex before there is a structure of military chain of command. And here I think I have to say something about what happened to the Ukrainian military and to the Ukrainian security structures. The Ukrainian military and security structures in the 4 years under Mr. Yanukovych, 2000 to 2000 and early 2014, were reconstituted, one, by the introduction of large numbers of Russian advisors in key positions, the penetration of the Soviet security services and military intelligence into advisory positions in both the Ukrainian security services and in the defense and in the militia. It is well known that the campaign of violence against the protesters was conducted by the Ukrainians, but that there was a Russian team of advisors operating out of the Ministry of Interior headquarters. That process over 4 years, on one level, on the level of the militias, basically created leadership structures of people who were involved in criminal enterprises. They were interviewed by the son of the president, and their loyalty meant that they had to participate in the process of raising cash for the family coffers. So everybody who was in a leadership position to direct militias, to direct security forces, to maintain order anywhere in the country, was still beholden to the network of the president that had fled and was compromised in some way by collaboration with them. So when Putin moved in Crimea, there was a weakened military structure. There was a security service that was completely penetrated by Russian intelligence and by, I would say, Russian proxies and Russian agents. And it took a long time, weeks and months, to get everything aligned, to have a proper chain of command, to have soldiers to be told how to act and in what circumstances. But by that time, this kind of a mass disorder and mass disintegration of the chain of command of the armed forces meant that no action was taken as the Russians moved very quickly to take Crimea. And as an opposition movement, an alleged opposition movement from the inside, but really one inspired by Russia, directed by Russian military intelligence officers and by Russian proxies, began to start operating in eastern Ukraine. But I will conclude by mindful of the time by saying why, in my view, this did not work. Mr. Putin was very emboldened by this. It was kind of easy. You sort of move in, within a few days, you move in 5,000 or 6,000 additional soldiers onto the territory of Crimea, special ops guys. They don't have any badges or uniforms. People are concerned. You're denying it first, later you admit it. You have some support because it's a place where there still is a majority. It's the only place in Ukraine where there's an ethnic Russian majority living on the territory of Crimea. So you have some support from the indigenous population. And you have a local elite that is buying into this. You have the Speaker of the Parliament that's colluding with you and basically shifting allegiances. And Mr. Putin thought that he could replicate this in southern Ukraine, in places like Odessa and Mykolaiv, and in Kherson along the Black Sea. He could replicate it in places like Kharkiv in the east, and certainly in Donetsk and in Luhansk in the far east, where there are majority Russian-speaking population. But something interesting happened. Polling that was done in mid-April showed that as this conflict was emerging, it was clear that Mr. Putin had miscalculated. He had misjudged the sentiment of the Ukrainian people. In Kherson, only 3% of people supported some kind of integration with Russia or the actions of the Russians on Ukrainian territory, and 88% were against. In Kharkiv, only 15% were for and 70% were against. In Odessa Oblast, in the Odessa region, 7% were for, 81% were against. Even in Luhansk, one of those regions where the conflict is still raging, only 20% were firmly on the pro-Russian side and 50% were against. The others were sort of in a gray area. And in Donetsk, again, 20% for and 63% against. In Dnipropetrovsk, 5% for and 85% against. So in all those areas where he thought he was going to create a large swath of protest and basically split the country in half, he found that the public was not going with him. So small crowds, 1,000 people, 2,000 people, he had sent in special ops people, guys heavily armed to take over, helping to take over buildings, to help in various military operations, but the public was not coming. There were a few violent clashes, but pretty much it was over. So then he upped the ante. He started massing troops on the Ukrainian border. He started sending in more proxies and more proxies, and probably several thousand in the end who are currently on Ukrainian territory. But there was just not enough of a basis among the Ukrainian people. And I think what he did by this aggression, both in Crimea and by this aggression by proxy in southern and eastern Ukraine, was for the first time, to create a sense of common Ukrainian national unity and to create a civic Ukrainian nation that is patriotic. When he realized that, when his intel finally came back to him, he has sort of pushed back a little bit, and because also fear of potentially much harsher sanctions, including especially sectoral sanctions in the financial sector, and the quixotic and the unrealistic expectation that he can do anything other than to occupy Ukraine, that he cannot come in as a liberator, or even with the simulation of a liberator. He can only come in as an occupier, has pushed him back. So I think that is the moment that we are in right now. Putin is still somewhat, he's not completely out of this because he still is bargaining. He wants assurances from Ukraine, so there's still money coming, a chain of supply for these insurgent fighters. But if you look at who these fighters are, the people who are running these so-called independent republics in Donetsk and Luhansk, which have come up, came into being about a month ago, they're all Muscovites. They're people with residences in Moscow. The Minister of Defense of the Donetsk People's Republic is a GRU, a Russian military officer from Moscow, retired. He's about 41 years old. The head of the prime minister or whatever of this self-proclaimed republic is also from Moscow. They have no association. Yesterday there was pitched battles in Donetsk, and 43 people from the rebel side, from the insurgent side, were wounded. The mayor of Donetsk today said that only 8 of them were natives. Everyone else was foreign, including large numbers of Chechens. I was in Kiev about a week ago, and I spoke with a woman who is a leading academic in Donetsk, and she lives this on a day-to-day basis. She basically said, the locals are basically, who are supporting this, are a combination of criminal gangs, of some people who had served for the Yanukovych regime and who are still being paid to continue to serve, people who are on fringe ultra-nationalist, Russian nationalist and Russian fascist political movements. But they tend to be very disorderly, very undisciplined. They tend to drink a lot and to party and to engage in small crimes and robberies to sustain themselves. And to back them up, the Russians have now sent in Chechen fighters in larger and larger numbers. And so a large portion of the people who are engaged in combat today are actually Caucasian, not just people from the Caucasus. They're a combination of Cossacks who, as you may know, by Russian law some of them are affiliated with the Russian Ministry of Interior and are paid as employees of the Russian Ministry of the Interior. They're involved in the conflict. There are ultra-right and Russian neo-fascist groupings that have sent their activists in for the fighting, and there are now these Chechen fighters. So a large portion of the fighting that's going on right now is not anything resembling a civil war. It is a kind of a financed criminal military operation using Russian proxies. That said, the Ukrainians, with some difficulty, certainly difficulty in holding elections in Luhansk and Donetsk, throughout the rest of the country got very normal turnouts. There was no violence and no real disruption of election patterns in the south and in many of the eastern areas where just a month or two ago many people feared that the Russian hand would be very, very strong. They elected in the first round overwhelmingly a pretty pragmatic, patriotic billionaire who is, I think, very capable of handling the economic challenges the country faces with a lot of experience. He was the governor of the central bank. He was the chairman of the board of the Central Bank of Ukraine. He was the head of the budget committee of the parliament. He also served as the head of the National Security Council in the first year of the Yushchenko government and served as foreign minister. So he has diplomatic skills, some security experience, and some economic experience. And I think those are the 3 main challenges. He has to handle the diplomacy with Russia and with Europe. He has to handle the economic crisis Ukraine faces, and he has to handle the security challenge. He will be inaugurated on either the 9th or 10th of June. He will be in Poland on June 4th and 5th, on the 4th to celebrate, I guess, the 30th anniversary. Is it? No, I'm trying to remember. Sorry? 25th, sorry. Yes, I should know better. Of the elections that brought the opening of Poland's path to democracy. I can talk about all these things, but I do want to say that this is where we are. This is where we are 6 months after the death and the turmoil and the violence began, and we still have death and turmoil and violence. But I think we can see now a pathway for Ukraine to taking control of this conflict, of overwhelming these rebel proxy forces, these really invader forces, and these artificially constructed separatist movements. And I'll be happy to take your questions as long as the chairman allows me that privilege.
I have to say that I admire Adrian quite a bit because for most of you who are Polish, you may remember in the old days getting very concerned about things that were happening to Solidarity, the imposition of martial law, all the bad things that most of us have now kind of put in the back of our minds. But Adrian is experiencing that every day because he sits through all these things. So the fact that he can detach himself and give a thorough analysis, an academic analysis, is quite an achievement. And if things are so bad in Ukraine, how come they're so good? Or to put it a different way, why do people like me, and also Adrian, I think, why are we optimists? Why do we see things perhaps where other people don't? The reason is that for quite a long time now, there's been a diplomatic battle brewing in Brussels and in Washington. The Ukrainians in the United States and Canada have for many years run a conference in Washington, in good times and in bad times, whose purpose was to keep Ukraine on the radar scope of American policymakers, and those policymakers also include Ukrainians. So the idea was that whether the news is good or bad, you still have an audience in Washington that should be listening to what you have to say about the ups and downs, the roller coaster, as Adrian put it in his remarks. Today you have an audience like that in Warsaw and in the other capitals of Europe. That in no small measure is due to the Foreign Service of Poland and to Radosław Sikorski, who has become a kind of poster boy, if you will, for Ukraine. He's along with other people inside the ministry and in other ministries in Poland, like the Interior Ministry, come up with a series of proposals that, to some extent, were enacted as a result of his inability to accept the word no. And some of them were not particularly popular ideas when they were first broached. One thing that the Poles did for those Ukrainians who were casualties at the Maidan in February and March of this year, when the medical system of Ukraine was just in chaos and unable to deal with the kinds of wounds that were coming their way, countries began to volunteer to take wounded people to their hospitals and to work on them there. And I don't have the complete number of people who were taken out of Ukraine for operations and for different kinds of medical help, but I came across a number of 173, which seems a little bit low for me. But out of those 173, 121 of them went to Poland. So the Polish budget essentially helped the Ukrainian side at a very crucial time when it was life or death for some of those people. And then afterwards, many of them stayed in Poland for a little while because private people volunteered to take Ukrainians into their homes. That's not something that diplomacy can accomplish. That's people-to-people diplomacy. The more formal kind of diplomacy you see in the reaction of the European Union to what was going on and what is going on in Ukraine. And here, I think Mr. Sikorski managed to mobilize some of his colleagues in Berlin and in Paris and in other capitals to do the right thing. What is the right thing, even if you don't see it today? Over the next few years, about $13 billion worth of support, of various kinds of support, will be making its way to Ukraine. That means that the West Europeans have, in essence, agreed that they should be more on the ball in dealing with what's going on in Ukraine, and that, I think, is partially the child, if you will, of Radosław Sikorski. What do Polish people think? Well, in political terms, when there's a right, there's a left. So some people thought that taking in wounded people was the best thing that you could possibly do at the moment. Other people said, but there are people waiting in line for different kinds of operations that won't take place because their place in line is being displaced by somebody who's Ukrainian. Am I surprised? Not particularly. Is this a normal thing? Also not particularly. Why? Because in Poland there's a lot of surveys that are taken. So polling companies ask people what they think about the Ukrainian situation. And in March there was a poll that was taken in which 47% of those people who were asked said that they felt threatened by what was happening in Ukraine. Out of those 47%, when they were asked who was to blame, it wasn't the Ukrainians. So I won't mention who they pointed to, but suffice it to say that there was a lot of common sense among ordinary people who would like to see the right thing done and are eager to do it if it doesn't cost them too much money or too much time. So that's one good thing that's happening in Poland, and it's not gone unnoticed. So some of you may read the Financial Times, a very well-written paper that comes out of Great Britain, and there was an article just a few days ago that praised Mr. Sikorski for his efforts on behalf of diffusing the situation in Ukraine and trying to talk sense to Mr. Putin. In that article, the authors indicated that he had a very good chance of becoming the replacement for Ms. Ashton, in effect becoming the foreign minister of the European Union. I don't know whether that will happen or not. I don't know if Mr. Sikorski would want to leave his position in Warsaw, but apparently it's making the rounds in places in Europe, and who knows, that might be one result of what's been going on for the last 6 months. Is this going to evaporate quickly? Are we going to see peace and prosperity in Ukraine because Petro Poroshenko says that he can deal with the Russians? Nobody knows. He's already said one very important thing on public television in Ukraine, in which he said that politicians should give up their business interests and do their job as politicians. And he said that he would sell his interests in his large confectionery company and strictly deal with the presidency. If that in fact turns out to be the case, then he'll be probably the first Ukrainian politician that has gone down that road. You'll forgive me if I'm a little bit skeptical because for politicians it's easy to line pockets. It's much more difficult to take a principled position and stick to it. So time will tell whether Mr. Poroshenko can do the job or not. From the point of view of Ukraine's neighbors in Europe and also the United States, countries are willing to support Ukraine in a variety of fashions, but part of it also means that the Ukrainians have to have their own internal discussion. So they have to come to an agreement among themselves before other countries will agree then to do all the things that they said they were happy to do. That's a discussion that has not yet taken place. And maybe President Poroshenko, or President-elect Poroshenko, will be able to do that. From the numbers that we heard from Adrian, they're a lot more optimistic than one would be led to believe by reading just the press. So we're in the middle of something here. We're not at the end, but maybe we're at the beginning of the end. Maybe this is Ukraine's path out of crisis. And in that crisis and in that turmoil in which it finds itself, it has at least one partner that it can count on, and that's Poland. So thank you very much. I open up the floor to questions, and I would ask you to identify yourselves and then ask your question.
I'm really following the situation. I'm really happy to see that Poland is so involved in Ukraine and doing such an amazing job and such an altruistic help. And that is just like the whole the notion of what Kosciuszko started, just fighting for freedom and helping it. And it's really nice to make me happy, and I'm really supporting it. But yet some of my colleagues brought to my attention a very interesting argument saying that what Sikorski is doing is just simply killing the Polish economy. And I was listening to him saying, you got to give me some explanation, tell me what's going on. So what I've heard was the following. Because Poland is a big supporter of Ukraine. Kosciuszko is one of the poster boys, as you named it yourself. And it's kind of against Russia's interests. Now, what Russia is doing is trying to economically isolate Poland or hurt economically by putting embargoes, bans, or simply buying less of our products. And then Russia, since we are located geographically so close, is our bigger, if not the biggest, economical partner as far as exporting meats, dairy, poultry, you name it. So my point, from my opinions being very strict and very certain, I'm kind of confused because I love what Sikorski's doing it and Poland is doing it in health, but I don't want to see Poland economy hurting at the same time. So I don't know, I just would like to maybe understand it a little better and see if there's a better solution, or how's the future looking like as far as in the light of that. Thank you.
You know, we live in a global economy with a very large capacity to absorb proteins and high quality foods. We have growing prosperity in Asia and in the Indian subcontinent. There are potentially, particularly in China, new markets for export. So if you're thinking of pork as an export product, I can think of no better environment for which. And in fact, you may know that there's a lot of Chinese interest in leasing and buying Ukrainian land for production for the Chinese market. Ukraine has a very strong, good agricultural infrastructure, black earth, and so on. And the Chinese were under Yanukovych all over this effort. So it just seems to me that it is possible. If you have, you know, when I travel in Britain, I only see trucks with Polish mushrooms every, you know, a quarter mile along the way, passing me or I passing them. I think it is easy for high quality products to saturate, and I think Poland has demonstrated that it is not an economy that is based on raw materials. It is an economy based on high value added, and I think that there are plenty of markets. I mean, even a country like Georgia, which was, you know, 30, 40, 50% linked to the Russian market, suffered from a complete boycott and complete isolation. They were able to reconfigure. They found out that actually other people, if you market their wine, it's not just Russians that like their wine. If you have good mineral water with good mineral resources, you can sell it at other markets. It requires a little bit of time. It may have some short-term consequences. But in the end, I think it is Russia that will suffer. We also have to. We can't really exaggerate. Russia's economic power. Russia has a lot of military power. It has the UN veto, and it has nuclear power. But in fact, the Russian economy is somewhere between Holland's and Italy's. And if there were kind of a trade war going on between Holland and Poland, I don't know if you would be like trembling in your boots. It would be a problem, but you wouldn't say it's the, you know, that the sky is falling. And I think that we have to really understand that Russia is a, you know, the North American and European economies together are over 20 times larger than the Russian economy. I think there are various ways of compensation and solidarity in these economies if Russia were to do something as short-sighted as to create trade wars with the Baltic states, with Ukraine, and with Poland.
Jackson, this is a question on sanctions. I hear that the U.S. is putting sanctions or trying to put sanctions. Is Europe supporting those sanctions, or are they so dependent on Russians' oil supplies that they really is just a lot of talk by Belarus?
Well, look, I think that Europe is clear. Europe has been behind the curve, and the U.S. has led. But the U.S. has led with, not even with sectoral sanctions, it's led with individual sanctions and sanctions on a couple banks and a couple financial institutions very closely linked to Mr. Putin and his closest allies. That said, the bigger sanction has been the massive flow of capital out of Russia, because there is the fear Mr. Putin's erratic behavior scares Russian businessmen and Russian oligarchs as well. And they are hedging, so they're moving their businesses out. I don't know if you saw, but BlackRock, which is the world's largest, whatever it is, hedge fund, investment fund, whatever it is, it's this huge instrument, sold all of its holdings in Russian bonds. That was not a sanction. That was, I suspect, a phone call by President Obama to Larry Fink, who acted in the national interest. And it just shows that Russia's not that big an economy that everyone will be trembling. But I think it's the threat of sanctions, and it's the uncertainty and the threat of sanctions triggered by Russian aggression, and the uncertainty among Russians and other investors that Putin is just about erratic enough to do something like this that has been creating turmoil in the markets. So the effects, the sanctions have been modest, but their effects have been very, very large. Probably about 100 billion in capital flight from Russia, about a 20% decline in the value of the Russian ruble over the last 4 or 5 months. Now, some of this has been organic teasing out, and then a flattening out of Russian growth. Russia is probably at no growth for this year and probably next year, and maybe negative growth once everything is churned out. And that, I think, has led also Putin. I think Putin would have continued his military threats and might have even considered an incursion if he had felt that there was more to work with on Ukrainian soil, that there were more people who would be, I would say, quislings, or who would be sympathetic and would be collaborators with the Russian occupation. But I think he found that it's a little tougher and the price would be much higher. So I think that especially the threat of sectoral sanctions, blocking the Russian economy from international banking transactions involving U.S. banks, their affiliates, and any banks that do business with U.S. banks. So the cascading effect of that, it's not been triggered, but it's out there, and I think it is a factor that has conditioned Russian behavior.
Is there any sustainability to those sanctions, given most of the sanctions, the effectiveness of them you just mentioned, seem to be macroeconomic, and there's going to be some lag indicator of some sort? Is it not too soon to say how effective those sanctions have been? Because merely the movement of capital from Russia to elsewhere would just quickly go back to Russia. So, A, is it too early to say that sanctions are effective? B, are they sustainable if they are? And C, is there not a moral concern? And I'm not particularly pro-Russian in this case, but to the point, if the concern with Putin is economically based on an oligarch, those people in his pocket, so to speak, is it appropriate, euphemistically, to say that the president calls BlackRock to pull money out of Russia? Is there not a morally questionable behavior there, given the whole purpose of the sanctions?
Well, I don't know if patriotism is a morally questionable form of behavior. And I think that it was very clear that whatever, I don't know what went on in the decision of BlackRock to liquidate all its fairly substantial holdings in Russian bonds, but I think that they also made, it was probably an easy decision for them to make, because Russia is just not that big an economy. It's just not that important. It is important if you're in the energy sector, and it may be important in one or two limited areas where Russians have rare earth metals and products that are needed by broader industry. But it is just not that big a player for it to have long-term consequences for a particular investor or whatever, except for a few sectors. That said, absolutely, look. To judge the effectiveness of sanctions must require the passage of time. But I would say that there's a sort of an interesting dynamic here. The market is anticipating more sanctions and anticipating and factoring in, or has been factoring in, Russian misbehavior. But if Russia is no longer misbehaving, the sanctions will have had their effect. I think there's no inclination to punish Mr. Putin for steps that he doesn't take. It's clear that the West has said, we disapprove of what was done in Crimea, but these sanctions are based on protracted aggression against Ukraine. If that doesn't occur, I don't think anyone will be bothered if there is an eventual moving of the pendulum back. So, but I do think that if there is erratic behavior, that there will trigger some sectoral sanctions. Those sectoral sanctions will deepen this cascading effect of capital flows, and it will have longer term consequences. But in any event, any projection of the state of the Russian economy is now projecting no growth for this year and no growth for next year. And I don't think that model is projecting the imposition of heavier sanctions. It's simply projecting the consequences of what has already happened. Now, as we know, the World Bank, IMF make adjustments every year on their projections 1 year forward, and we may have some modest projection, but we won't. But it's very clear that the Russian economy is not about to be on some sort of a major takeoff or major rebound. And I'm not saying that all of it is the result of this kind of a policy, but we see the consequences of this young man who created the Russian version of Facebook, Kontakte. He is forced out by a group of cronies of the president. Today we saw German Gref, or yesterday, took over a board position on Yandex, another internet stock. I mean, these are trends that are driving the best and brightest innovators in Russia away. They're selling their assets and they're moving away. And I don't know where Mr. Durov, the founder of Kontakte, is ending up, but he's taking his 20 top programmers and he's left the country. And I think that's a very bad sign for Russia. It's a very bad sign for an authoritarian model, and it's a very bad sign for a model of an aggressive country. It does not, I think, calm the nerves of investors. So unless Mr. Putin calms down, Mr. Putin is his own sanction against himself. I don't think this is so much the action of others. It's his behavior that I think raises concerns about long-term commitments into leading sectors of the Russian economy.
Do you believe that Mr. Putin miscalculated? And if he did, is he erratic enough to resort to force?
Well, look, I sort of made a little bit of a case. I didn't really tease it out that I do think he miscalculated. He thought that, there are two theories about Putin. Theory one is that he is this great chessboard genius, thinking, 8 steps, 12 steps ahead of everyone else. And the other is that he is an opportunist looking for weaknesses and pouncing on them. And I tend to be more inclined to believe the latter. I don't think he has the sort of the breadth of vision and the quality of mind that suggests a person who's thinking everything through. I think he's acting more on the indecisiveness of the West or a kind of lack of cohesion rather than out of some great ability to reason things out. But I do think that he thought he had a very simplistic model of Ukraine and of Ukrainian identity. I think he saw, the Russians invested a lot into this policy of promoting the schism in Ukraine along language issues, or using the Russian Orthodox Church as a soft power, projector of soft power. And I think it was oversold to him. And I think he understands a little bit better that this isn't really working exactly how he thought. And I also think that the effects of the economy are important to him, because just as he is afraid, I think that why is Ukraine threatening to him? Ukraine, I think, is willing to make a deal and say we're not going to join NATO. Ukraine is willing to try to find some kind of a formula as it integrates into Europe to continue deep trade relations. I was in Kiev just a week ago, and I spoke with a few leaders in the Ukrainian defense establishment. And it was an off-the-record discussion, but they basically said, look, we're not going to do joint arms production with the Russians for Russian weapon systems, because we're not crazy. But we have some contracts for export where we're both producing components of weapons exports for weapon systems to other countries. And we hate them. They've taken a piece of our territory, but we need to keep these jobs. And these are the guys who are the custodians of the national security. We're basically taking a very pragmatic attitude. We're going to have to work with them. So if Mr. Putin understands that these people are not the figments of Russian propaganda of some ultra-right neo-fascist groups, I'm sure he doesn't believe that, he may be able to pull back, particularly if the West continues to follow the kinds of policies that Radek Sikorski has been urging. And I would say that one of those components is to help the Ukrainians, not to help them to fight for them, but to give them the capacity to inflict a lot of pain and to have the capacity to have a substantial deterrent against aggression or against new proxy wars that the Kremlin may want to launch in the future.
Al Kaprowski.
What are your thoughts on the Crimea? Do you think that it'll stay Russian, or do you think that the Ukrainians will fight for it?
Well, first, the second question is easier. The Ukrainians will not fight for it. But I spoke with a number of, again, these were off-the-record discussions, so I won't say which Ukrainian officials and leaders I spoke with. And one of them said, off the record, you know, we will attack the annexation of Crimea, we will demand its return, but we will probably in the foreseeable future not see it returning to us. But in that attack and in this campaign against the annexation of Crimea, we will have shaped a unified Ukrainian nation. And he said that will be at least the one good outcome out of the loss of territory. It's a little bit, you know, it's a little bit complicated. Crimea is economically non-viable. It really needs to be attached to a peninsula that is not attached to any landmass, doesn't have a port facility because most products were moved along rail. It's going to be a huge cost to get Russia to get it right. Water supplies, Ukrainians have just raised by 30 times the cost of supplying the peninsula with fresh water. Then there is the Ukrainian claims. The Ukrainians have launched a process making a claim of $100 billion in the loss of facilities and assets based on the occupation and annexation of Crimea. They're not recognizing that annexation, but they're claiming, they're initiating judicial claims, and that may, and Russia, I think, as a citizen of the international economy, will probably face protracted claims and counterclaims. And Ukraine has a debt against Russia. That debt can be then held diminished by the. So I think Russia is going to be facing a lot of economic pain for this rash, impulsive decision to pounce on Ukrainian territory. At the same time, Mr. Putin's ratings went up 10 or 15% more, where he is hasn't seen these kinds of ratings since basically the victory in the Chechen war, and so he's benefited in that way. But on balance, I think clearly the Ukrainians, I think, are going to be happy to get control over the mainland of Ukraine and to reach some kind of an accommodation with Russia that it is not throwing new proxies and new disruptive military operations against it. But I think they will use Crimea as a rallying point for national consolidation and national unity. But I think that the only way that Crimea will come back to Ukraine is if there is a similar revolution to the one in the Maidan that overthrew Mr. Yanukovych, if there is a similar revolution that overthrows Mr. Putin. And even then, I don't think that the return of Crimea is likely. I think what would be more likely is that there would be another referendum, a real referendum that would determine the future of Crimea. And there, I wouldn't bet necessarily that the people of Crimea would vote to return.
First, I'd like to thank Kościuszko Foundation for organizing this lecture. I think that's a terrific way of being current with what's happening on the political scene. And you started your presentation with remembering how Kuran had a lecture in Warsaw about the fact that there will be no independent Poland without independent Ukraine. And the last Polish politician that was seriously involved with creating some sort of union or understanding with Ukraine was Kosciuszko. And we know that it didn't really end in any success. But I think now is the time when Ukraine and Poland can really approach each other in a new way and overcome hundreds of years of hatred and fighting and create something that will be like counterbalance to Russia in the region. And what is your prediction? What's going to happen now moving forward, since Ukraine has new president and it appears that the situation in the east is gradually being controlled?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned historic antecedents, and I do want to point out that you know the difference, I think, between the 1920s and the immediate post-revolutionary period was that there was not a North Atlantic community of such power and such capacity, and that Poland was not fully integrated into an alliance structure that would comfortably defend its efforts to ally with Ukraine. And I think that it's very different of self-confident Poland that is part of both NATO and the European Union undertaking a policy to help Ukraine protect its sovereignty than one which was basically a single country's policy in a period where there was turmoil in Germany, where there was turmoil in Russia, where there was a sort of wave of revolutions, invasions, and so on. So I think that the circumstances are better to give this kind of cooperative tradition another chance. And I do think, I mean, Ukraine. You know, the other thing that I would say is that every week, every day when you visit, and I visit Kiev about 10 times a year, at every time that I'm in Kiev, there is some major cultural figure, political figure, government leader, business leader, or leaders in the country, interacting with people. And this isn't just Lvov, this isn't just the West, this is in Kiev. And I dare say that if I were venturing further east, Dnipropetrovsk and elsewhere, we would find a lot of the same thing. And I think that this kind of a cultural relationship has had a lot of impact on you know, mending some of the problems that had existed in the relationship between the two communities and the two peoples. And I think that this. I don't know if it's a conscious policy. I think that you know, at one level it was driven by the fact that Poles have tried to see some opportunity in Ukraine, economic opportunity. It has not often been rewarded. The efforts have been pretty paltry, and a lot of Polish companies have made long-term efforts, but because of the networks of corruption, they did not succeed in the way that they had hoped to succeed in penetrating that market. I think now, with a government that is probably going to be playing, I mean, it's not going to be a perfect government, it's not going to get rid of corruption entirely, but the massive scale of corruption that existed before, I think will make the country more open to Poland. So I think all those factors, economic factors, the fact that Poland is part of these large alliance and economic structures, give it a unique opportunity to, you know, and I've been party to discussions with government leaders who shall remain nameless from Poland, and they sort of say, well, you know, we've spent all this time, what have we got to show for it? There's not a single major Polish investment deal that doesn't have a problem with it. You know, X has to call Y to get the tax police off the backs of Polish company Z. You know, this has been a sort of a perennial problem of predatory practices. The Ukrainians haven't really returned their favor to Poles for their political, diplomatic, and economic interest in the country. This may be the moment where we see that changing. And certainly, if you look at the people who are on the square in Maidan, if you look at the faces, if you look at the sophistication of the people who are on, you know, who've created civic television, who've created new independent media, who've done internet, you will see a lot of the spirit of the people from the, you know, first of '68 and then of '80, '81. Resident in Ukraine, and I think that's really the best hope for this relationship finally being to the benefit of both sides. Because I do think, to be very honest with you, I do think that the Polish embrace of Ukraine over these last 20 years has been so consistent that it is sort of hard for me to understand. But there has been this consistent, almost romantic interest in helping the country pry it away from Russia. And I think that is a long-standing interest of Polish foreign policy. It's a long-standing tradition. But you've gotten very little back from the Ukrainians. And I think that there is now the opportunity. I think that this is the first chance, really. We thought that had happened when the Orange Revolution came. But I think that the society had, unfortunately, the president was not a strong president, and he did not use the first 100 days to move decisively. I worry that Mr. Poroshenko can be a strong president, but his first 100 days, 50 days will be spent trying to reestablish control in the East. But I do think that there's still a strong possibility that with this European assistance, U.S. assistance, and a belief that really Ukraine is now in the front line. It's the front line of Western civilization. So I want to refer again. My wife is a historian; she will probably correct me. But the Cossacks. What were the Cossacks? The Cossacks patrolled in the interests of Western powers uncontrollable eastern territories, and they were given resources. Eventually they became an independent force, but initially that was their role. So Ukraine is once again this outpost, potentially this outpost of the West, on the border of a very hostile neighbor. So.
Let me stop the proceedings, the formal proceedings here, and continue the questions and answers downstairs with a glass of wine. And maybe more of you can get a question out rather than the format that we're in. So thank you very much for coming. If you're not a member of the Kościuszko Foundation, you can easily become one.
The IMF aid, it's like $1 billion. Europe is putting in 15, but paying the difference on the discounted rate versus the market rate. The country with the biggest foreign direct investment is Cyprus, which means it's. Yes, of course. I'll give you
But if they do, I mean,